That bastard child isn't welcome in my house. My father's voice cracked through the dining room so sharply that every fork stopped moving. For a second, nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed. The smell of turkey gravy and sweet potatoes still hung in the air. The football game was playing softly on the television in the den. My nephew Tyler was halfway through a dinner roll, and my 72-year-old father, Frank Dawson, was standing at the head of the Thanksgiving table, pointing directly at my stomach. I was 46 years old, 6 months pregnant, and suddenly I felt 12. My mother had been gone almost 8 years by then. Since her passing, Thanksgiving dinner had always been held at Dad's ranch-style house on South Fremont Avenue in Springfield, Missouri. Every year looked exactly the same. Same folding tables, same old pumpkin pie recipe, same arguments about politics, same family photographs hanging in the hallway. I had spent most of my life trying to keep the peace in that house. That day, peace didn't stand a chance. "Dad," I said quietly. "No." His face was turning red. "No, you're going to answer me." My sister Linda stared at her plate. Her husband suddenly became very interested in his mashed potatoes. Nobody wanted to be involved. Dad pointed again. "Who is the father?" The room felt smaller by the second. I looked around the table. My nieces, my nephews, my cousins, people I'd known my entire life, all watching, waiting. The truth was simple. I was married, legally married, happily married. But Dad didn't know that. Very few people did. And in that moment, I wasn't ready to explain everything. "I'll talk to you later," I said. His laugh was bitter. "Later." He shook his head. "You're 46 years old. You show up pregnant and expect people not to ask questions. Dad, you've embarrassed this family enough." The words landed harder than I expected. Maybe because part of me had feared this moment for months, I knew how he thought. He cared about appearances, what people said, what the neighbors thought, what church members whispered after Sunday service. I had spent years trying to fit inside the version of life he approved of. The right job, the right behavior, the right image. Apparently, pregnancy at 46 didn't fit the plan. His finger remained pointed at me. "You should be ashamed." The room went silent again. Then came the sentence I still remember word for word. "That bastard child brought disgrace into this family." My chest tightened. I felt the baby move. Just a small kick. A reminder that this wasn't only about me anymore. I placed a hand on my stomach, slowly, protectively. Dad noticed. His expression didn't soften, not even a little. Instead, he stepped back and folded his arms. "If that's how you want to live, then you can do it somewhere else." The realization hit me before he actually said it. I knew what was coming. "Get out!" Nobody moved. Nobody protested. Not even Linda. I don't blame her now. At the time I did. But Frank Dawson had spent decades controlling every room he entered. People learned to stay quiet. I stood carefully. Pregnancy had made me slower than usual. My purse was hanging over the back of my chair. I grabbed it. My keys. My coat. The entire time I kept waiting for someone to speak. Anyone. A cousin. An aunt. My sister. Nothing. The only sound was silverware lightly touching plates. I felt tears threatening. I refused to let them fall. Not there. Not in front of him. Dad crossed his arms tighter. "You heard me." I looked directly at him. For one brief second, I almost told him everything. I almost told him about Michael, about the courthouse wedding, about the life we'd built together, about the reason I'd spent months keeping things private. But something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe exhaustion. Maybe I simply didn't want my marriage to become another argument. So I nodded once. Then I walked out. The November air hit me immediately.
Cold.
Sharp. Gray clouds covered most of the sky. I climbed into my old silver Honda Accord and shut the door. The second it closed, the tears finally came. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, crying harder than I had in years. The windshield blurred. My makeup probably looked awful. I didn't care. After 10 minutes, I started driving. No destination. Just away. Away from that house. Away from the silence. Away from the humiliation. I eventually pulled into the Walmart parking lot on West Sunshine Street. It was packed with holiday shoppers. People pushing carts. Families carrying bags. Normal life continuing as if my world hadn't just exploded. I parked near the edge of the lot and turned off the engine. For a while, I simply sat there, thinking. The worst part wasn't being thrown out. The worst part was realizing how long I'd been afraid of disappointing my father. 46 years old. Successful career. Homeowner. Married. Expecting a child. Yet one angry sentence from him still had the power to reduce me to tears. That realization hurt more than anything he'd said. I wiped my eyes, looked down at my wedding ring, twisted it gently. Then my phone buzzed. A text message. 3 simple words. "I'm almost there. Hold on." I stared at the screen. The message was from Michael, my husband. The one person who always seemed to know when something was wrong. I hadn't called him yet. I hadn't texted him. Somehow he knew anyway. I took a shaky breath, then another. For the first time all afternoon, I didn't feel completely alone. I looked through the windshield at the busy parking lot. People coming and going. Cars moving past. Life continuing. And somewhere on the highway outside Springfield, Michael was driving toward me. I had no idea that before the day was over, my father would come face to face with the man he never expected. And nothing in our family would ever be the same again. I was still sitting in that Walmart parking lot when I saw Michael's truck pull in. Even from a distance, I recognized it immediately. A dark blue Ford F-150 with enough miles on it to circle the country several times. He parked beside me and stepped out. The moment he saw my face, he knew. No questions. No guessing. Just concern. He opened my passenger door and climbed in. "Diane." That was all he said. My composure vanished. I started crying again. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just exhausted tears from someone who'd spent an entire afternoon holding herself together. Michael reached over and took my hand. We sat there quietly for a minute. The parking lot lights were beginning to come on as daylight faded. Families loaded groceries into their cars. Somebody pushed a shopping cart across the asphalt. Life kept moving. Finally, I told him everything. Every word. Every insult. Every second of silence from the family. I repeated the sentence about my baby. The moment those words left my mouth, I saw something change in Michael's face. Not anger exactly. Something colder. More controlled. The kind of expression I'd seen before when he talked about difficult situations overseas. The expression of a man who had learned how to stay calm under pressure. When I finished, he sat quietly for several seconds. Then he nodded. "Let's go." I blinked. "Go where? Back to your father's house?" "No." The answer came immediately. Too quickly. Michael looked at me. "Why not?" "Because it'll make things worse." He actually laughed. A short laugh. Not because anything was funny, because he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Diane." "What?" "Your father just threw his pregnant daughter out of Thanksgiving dinner." I stared out the window. He wasn't wrong. Still, I shook my head. "You don't know him." "I know enough." "You really don't." Michael leaned back in his seat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled slightly. "You know what's funny?" I looked at him. "What?" "I spent 26 years in the Army. I knew where this was going." He continued. "I've been shot at." I nodded. "Twice." "I know. I've been deployed to places where people actively wanted me dead." I couldn't help smiling. "Michael." He pointed toward the direction of my father's house. "And somehow I'm more nervous about meeting your father." That caught me off guard. I laughed. An actual laugh. The first one all day. Michael grinned. "There she is." I shook my head. "You are impossible. Occupational hazard." For a little while we simply sat together. The tension eased. Not completely. Just enough for me to breathe again. That's one thing Michael always did well. He never rushed people. Never forced emotions. He simply stayed present. Maybe that's why we worked so well together. We hadn't exactly fallen into each other's lives dramatically. No whirlwind romance. No movie-style love story. Just 2 people meeting at the right time. 2 years earlier, I'd volunteered at a literacy program for veterans at the Springfield Public Library where I worked. Michael had been helping organize community outreach events after returning from an overseas assignment. The first time I met him, I honestly didn't know he was a colonel. He never mentioned it. In fact, I learned about his military rank from someone else nearly 3 weeks later. When I confronted him, he shrugged. It didn't seem important. That was Michael, the least flashy high-ranking military officer I'd ever met. Over time, we became friends, then close friends, then something more, slowly, naturally. At our age, neither of us felt the need to rush. He was 52, a widower. His wife had passed away from cancer years earlier. He carried that loss quietly, respectfully. By the time we married at the courthouse that spring, it felt less like a beginning and more like finding home. We kept the ceremony small, just a few people, no big announcement, no social media, no fuss. Dad never found out because Michael left for another assignment shortly afterward. Then life became busy. 1 month became 3. 3 became 6. Before I knew it, Thanksgiving arrived. Along with all the complications that came with being visibly pregnant. Michael squeezed my hand. You don't have to face him alone. I looked at him. The sincerity in his eyes nearly broke me. For years I'd handled everything myself. Every problem, every disappointment, every family crisis. Having someone stand beside me still felt unfamiliar. Maybe we should just go home, I said. We can. His answer surprised me. No argument. Michael smiled. I'll follow your lead. That made the decision harder. If he'd pushed, I might have refused automatically. Instead, he gave me a choice. And that choice forced me to think honestly. What was I afraid of? Dad's anger. I'd already experienced it. His judgment. That ship had sailed. His rejection. He'd already thrown me out. I looked down at my wedding ring, then at my stomach, then back at Michael. No. What? I took a deep breath. No, we go back. His eyebrows lifted. You sure? Not really. Good enough. 20 minutes later, we were driving toward my father's neighborhood. The closer we got, the more nervous I became. My hands felt cold. My stomach tightened. Several times I almost asked Michael to turn around. I didn't. When we finally reached the house, cars still lined the curb. Thanksgiving dinner was apparently continuing without me. Michael parked. Neither of us moved immediately. The porch light glowed against the darkening sky. I recognized every vehicle. Linda's SUV, my cousin Greg's pickup, my Aunt Ruth's Buick, family, the people who had watched me walk out. Michael opened his door. I followed. The cold air felt sharper now. As we walked toward the house, a neighbor across the street glanced our way. Then another. People notice things in Springfield neighborhoods, especially on holidays, especially when an unfamiliar military vehicle appears. By the time we reached the front steps, I could already see curtains moving. Someone was watching. Michael adjusted his jacket. Not because he was nervous, because old habits never leave military people. Then he looked at me. One last chance. We can still leave. I shook my head. No. Okay. He offered his arm. I took it. Together we walked inside. The moment the front door opened, conversation stopped. Again, just like before. Every face turned toward us. But this time I wasn't alone. My father stood near the dining room. His expression hardened immediately. Then his eyes shifted to Michael. Confusion flickered across his face. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody understood why a distinguished-looking stranger had just entered Thanksgiving dinner beside me. The room waited. Michael stepped forward calmly. His posture straightened. Years of military discipline settling naturally into place. Then he stopped. Stood at attention. Raised his hand in a crisp military salute. Looked directly at my father. And said 7 words that changed everything. No one gets to insult my wife. For a few seconds after Michael spoke, nobody moved. Nobody blinked. The entire room looked frozen. My father stared at him, then at me, then back at Michael. It was as if his brain was struggling to catch up. Your wife, he finally asked. Michael lowered his hand. Yes, sir. The room erupted, not loudly, more like a dozen whispered conversations happening all at once.
What?
They got married. When... Are you serious? My cousin Greg nearly dropped his drink. Aunt Ruth looked like she had just witnessed a UFO landing in the backyard. Even Linda's mouth hung open. Dad looked directly at me. You're married. I nodded. Since April. April. His voice rose. April. Yes. The silence that followed felt different from before. Not hostile. Just stunned. Dad looked at Michael carefully for the first time. Michael stood calmly beside me. Straight posture. Gray at the temples. Confident without trying to be. The kind of man who looked exactly like what he was. Reliable. Disciplined. Steady. Dad folded his arms. And who exactly are you? Michael extended his hand. Colonel Michael Walker, United States Army. That generated another round of whispers. My father didn't take the hand. Not immediately. Instead, he studied Michael. The decorated service pins. The bearing. The confidence. Eventually, he shook his hand. Briefly. Almost reluctantly. Then he looked back at me. You hid this. I nodded. Yes. Why? I could have given a dozen answers. Because Michael was deployed. Because we wanted privacy. Because life moved quickly. But the honest answer slipped out. Because I knew you'd react like this. That one landed. His jaw tightened. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, he would apologize. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just enough to acknowledge what had happened. Instead he doubled down. I had every right to ask questions. Michael spoke calmly. No one disagrees with that. Dad looked at him. You stay out of this. I can't. Why not? Michael didn't raise his voice. Because he never needed to. Because Diane is my wife. That ended that argument. At least temporarily. The room settled into an awkward silence. People drifted back toward their seats. Nobody knew what to do. Dinner had transformed into something completely different. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. Because that's when Aunt Ruth decided to speak. And Aunt Ruth had never been known for keeping secrets. At 80 years old, she considered filters unnecessary. She took a sip of iced tea, set her glass down, then looked directly at my father. Frank, this whole thing is ridiculous. Dad sighed. Not now, Ruth. No, now. A few relatives immediately looked nervous. That should have been a warning. When Aunt Ruth started a sentence with, "No, now," trouble usually followed. She pointed her fork at my father. You're acting like some kind of saint. Dad's face tightened. Ruth. No. She shook her head. You spent years judging people. The room grew quiet again. A very different kind of quiet. The kind that appears right before something important happens. Aunt Ruth continued. Tell them. Dad's eyes narrowed. Tell them what? She laughed. A short, disbelieving laugh. The same thing your daughter just went through. I felt my stomach drop. Because suddenly several older relatives exchanged glances. The kind of glances people share when they all know something. Something significant. Something buried. Something old. Dad stood completely still. Enough. No. Aunt Ruth leaned back in her chair. You don't get to shame your daughter for something you did yourself. The room exploded into confusion. What does that mean? What is she talking about? Greg looked around like he was watching a tennis match. My father looked furious, and for the first time all evening nervous. That caught my attention immediately. I couldn't remember ever seeing my father nervous. Not once. Then Aunt Ruth delivered the bomb. You got Helen pregnant before you married her. The room fell silent. Again. Only this silence felt heavier. My mother, Helen Dawson, dead 8 years, beloved by everyone, and apparently connected to a story I had never heard. I stared at my father. Dad! His face turned pale. Not red. Pale. That alone told me everything. Aunt Ruth continued before he could respond. You two rushed the wedding because Helen was already expecting. My cousin Greg blinked. No way. Another aunt nodded slowly. It's true. Then an uncle spoke up. So is this really the first time we're discussing it? Several relatives started talking at once. Stories surfaced. Old memories. Family gossip buried for decades. Names. Dates. Events. Little pieces of history fitting together. The more people spoke, the clearer the picture became. My father had spent 40 years criticizing people for choices remarkably similar to his own. The irony was almost unbelievable. Then Uncle Charlie, who had been quiet all afternoon, finally shook his head and muttered, Frank, you've spent 40 years criticizing people for doing exactly what you did. The timing was perfect. The delivery was perfect. Several people immediately laughed. Not because the situation was funny, because the truth was impossible to ignore. Even I laughed. Against my better judgment. The room followed. A nervous ripple of laughter spread through the house. My father looked absolutely miserable. For once he wasn't controlling the conversation. For once everyone else had the facts. I should have felt satisfied. Part of me did. Another part felt strangely sad. Because beneath the anger and hypocrisy stood an aging man whose carefully constructed image was beginning to crack. And despite everything, he was still my father. I looked at Michael. He remained silent, observing, giving me space. The evening slowly wound down after that. People left in small groups. Nobody wanted additional drama. By 9 o'clock, most of the family had gone home. Michael and I were preparing to leave when Aunt Ruth quietly approached me. Diane. I turned. She lowered her voice. There's something else. My stomach tightened. What? Her expression changed. Suddenly serious. Concerned. I wasn't going to tell you tonight. Tell me what? She glanced toward my father, who was standing alone in the kitchen. Then back at me. Frank's been talking? I frowned. What do you mean? He's been telling people you're irresponsible. My heart sank. Aunt Ruth continued. Church members. I felt sick. Neighbors. Worse. People around town. My hands tightened. How long? She hesitated. Months. Months. Not days. Not weeks. Months. Long before Thanksgiving. Long before today's argument. Long before he supposedly needed answers. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't just one terrible afternoon. My father had already been building a story about me. A false one. Quietly. Behind my back. And suddenly I understood something important. The humiliation I experienced today hadn't started at Thanksgiving dinner. It had started much earlier. I looked across the room at my father. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. And that clarity would eventually lead me to a decision that neither of us saw coming. The drive home that night was quiet. Not uncomfortable. Just thoughtful. Michael kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting near mine on the center console. Springfield was settling down after Thanksgiving. Storefronts glowed along Sunshine Street. Christmas lights had already begun appearing on houses throughout town. Most people were ending the holiday with leftovers and football. I was ending it with a completely different understanding of my family. For months afterward, I tried to let it go. I really did. People always assume revenge begins with anger. In my experience, it starts with disappointment. I wanted to move forward. Focus on my pregnancy. Focus on my marriage. Focus on the future. For a while, that's exactly what I did. December arrived. Then January. Life continued. I spent my mornings at the library. Michael split his time between work and home. We prepared the nursery, assembled furniture, argued about baby names. Normal things, healthy things. But every few weeks, another piece of information found its way to me. Always unexpectedly. Always from someone else. One Sunday after church, an older woman approached me near the parking lot. She looked uncomfortable. "Diane." "Yes." "I just wanted to say, I'm glad things aren't true." My stomach tightened. "What things?" The poor woman looked embarrassed. Then I knew. Another rumor. A few days later, a local business owner I had known for years made a strange comment about late-life mistakes. Then a former neighbor awkwardly asked whether the baby's father was involved. The pattern became impossible to ignore. My father hadn't simply judged me privately. He had been actively shaping a narrative. One that painted me as irresponsible, immoral, embarrassing. The details varied. The message stayed the same. And every time I heard another story, I felt something inside me harden. Not into hatred, into determination. One evening in February, I sat at the kitchen table while Michael washed dishes. Outside, freezing rain tapped against the windows. I stared at my coffee. Finally, I said it. "I want to do something." Michael turned off the water. "What kind of something?" I looked up. "I want the truth out there." He studied me carefully. Not judging, just listening. That's different from revenge. I know. Is it? The question stung because it was fair. I honestly didn't know. Part of me wanted justice. Part of me wanted my father to experience consequences. Part of me simply wanted people to stop believing lies. The problem was separating those things. Michael dried his hands, then sat beside me. "You know what worries me." "What?" "Bitterness." I nodded slowly. "Because it worried me too. The last thing I wanted was to become obsessed. I had seen people spend years fighting old battles. Years carrying resentment. Years allowing one person to dominate their thoughts. I didn't want that life. But I also didn't believe silence was the answer. For weeks I wrestled with it. Then unexpectedly an opportunity appeared. Every year our church hosted a large Christmas charity banquet. Because of scheduling changes, the annual event had been postponed until late February. Several hundred people attended. Business owners, teachers, retirees, veterans, community leaders. Most of Springfield seemed to show up. This year, the church asked me to speak about the literacy program at the library. Normally, I would have given a short presentation and gone home. But after thinking carefully, I realized something. I didn't need revenge. I needed honesty. So I accepted. The night of the banquet arrived cold and clear. The fellowship hall buzzed with conversation. Round tables filled the room. Coffee stations lined the walls. People greeted friends they hadn't seen in months. Michael accompanied me. So did several coworkers. To my surprise, my father attended too. When I saw him across the room, I nearly changed my mind. Old instincts resurfaced. Avoid conflict. Keep peace. Stay quiet. For a moment, I considered walking away. Then Michael squeezed my hand. Not pushing, just reminding me I wasn't alone. The program began at 7. A few church announcements. A fundraising update. Recognition of volunteers. Then my name was called. As I walked toward the podium, my heart pounded. Not because I feared public speaking. I had done plenty of that. Because I knew what I intended to say. The room settled. Several hundred faces looked my way. I began with the literacy program. The volunteers. The veterans. The success stories, everything normal, everything expected. Then I paused, took a breath, and changed direction. I'd like to share something personal. The room became noticeably quieter. I could feel Michael watching from the audience. I could also feel my father's eyes. I continued, calmly, slowly. No theatrics, no anger, just facts. I spoke about my marriage, how Michael and I met, why we chose a private wedding, how excited we were to become parents. Then I described Thanksgiving, the confrontation, the accusations, being thrown out. You could have heard a pin drop. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I simply told the truth. Then came the difficult part. The rumors, months of gossip, stories spread behind my back, false assumptions presented as facts. I never mentioned my father's name. Not once. I didn't have to. Everyone knew. The room understood. Then I addressed the family secret. Carefully, respectfully. I explained that the same standards used to judge me had not always been applied equally, that none of us are perfect, that hypocrisy damages families, more than mistakes ever could. At that point, my father stood. For one terrifying second, I thought he was about to storm toward the stage. Instead, he simply said, "That's enough." The room turned toward him. I looked directly at him. Not angry, not afraid, just steady. And then something remarkable happened. An older church member stood. Then another. Then another. People who had known my parents for decades. One by one, they quietly confirmed the truth. Not maliciously, not dramatically, just honestly. We knew. It happened years ago. Everyone makes mistakes. The confirmations kept coming. The room shifted. Not against my father. Against the double standard. Against the judgment. Against the hypocrisy. For the first time in his life, Frank Dawson found himself unable to control the story. Because facts have a stubborn way of surviving, no matter how long they're buried. I looked toward Michael. He hadn't spoken a single word all evening. He simply stood beside the stage. Present, steady, supportive. Exactly as he had been from the beginning. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then someone started clapping. Another joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room rose to its feet. A standing ovation. Not for me. For honesty. For resilience. For refusing to be defined by someone else's version of events. I glanced toward my father. The applause wasn't humiliating him. That surprised me. Instead, it isolated him. Because for the first time, everyone could see the gap between who he claimed to be and who he actually was. And there was nowhere left to hide. As the applause continued, I realized something unexpected. The victory didn't feel triumphant. It felt peaceful, because the truth was finally standing on its own. And I no longer had to carry it by myself. After the banquet, people around Springfield talked. Of course they did. It's what small and mid-sized American towns have always done. They talked after church services, over coffee at Ziggy's Cafe, while standing in line at Hy-Vee, during Rotary Club meetings, at high school basketball games. The difference this time was that nobody was repeating rumors. They were discussing facts. For years, my father had enjoyed the benefit of a carefully maintained reputation. Now people saw him more clearly, not as a monster, not as a villain, just as a flawed man who had judged others more harshly than he judged himself. The change happened gradually. Nobody shunned him. Nobody ran him out of town. Life isn't usually that dramatic. Instead, something much simpler happened. People stopped automatically agreeing with him, stopped treating his opinions as unquestionable, stopped assuming he was always right. And for a man like Frank Dawson, that was a difficult adjustment. Several relatives told me he became quieter, less confident, less eager to criticize everyone else's choices. Meanwhile, life at home moved forward. In April, our son arrived. 7 pounds 11 ounces. Healthy. Loud. Absolutely determined to announce his presence to the world. The labor lasted nearly 14 hours. By the end, I was convinced I had forgotten every breathing technique I'd ever learned. Michael remained beside me the entire time. Calm as always. At one point, I may have threatened to strangle him. He still laughs about that. Our son was named Benjamin, a name we both loved. The first few weeks were exhausting, wonderful, terrifying, beautiful, sometimes all at once. Sleep became a distant memory. Coffee became a survival tool. The nursery we had carefully prepared somehow always looked like a tornado had passed through. But I was happy, truly happy. For the first time in a long while, my attention focused on the future rather than the past. Then in early summer, I received a phone call. It came from Linda. My sister rarely called during work hours. I knew immediately something was wrong. "Diane?" Her voice sounded strained. "What happened?" "It's Dad." My stomach tightened. "What about him?" "He had chest pains. Everything else disappeared. All the old anger, all the frustration, all the hurt. Gone in an instant. Because no matter what had happened between us, he was still my father." Within 30 minutes, Michael and I were driving toward Mercy Hospital. The doctors eventually determined it wasn't a heart attack. A serious warning. But not a heart attack. Still, Dad looked older when I entered his room. Much older. The hospital gown didn't help. Neither did the exhaustion in his face. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The machines beeped quietly. Nurses moved through the hallway. Sunlight filtered through the blinds. Finally, I pulled a chair beside his bed. "Hi, Dad." He looked at me. His eyes seemed different. Less defensive. Less certain. "Hi." The conversation that followed wasn't dramatic. No movie speeches. No grand emotional breakthrough. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, we talked awkwardly. Carefully. Like two people crossing a frozen pond. Eventually, he looked down at his hands. "I handled things badly." I waited. Those 5 words may not sound impressive. But from Frank Dawson, they were enormous. "I know." He nodded slowly. A long silence followed. Then he surprised me. I was scared. I frowned. "Scared of what?" He stared out the window. "Getting older." That wasn't the answer I expected. He continued. "Watching everything change." I listened. The world. The family. My place in it. His voice sounded tired. "When your mother died, I think I started holding tighter to everything. For the first time, I wasn't hearing an argument. I was hearing honesty. Raw and imperfect honesty." He shook his head. "I thought if I controlled things, I could stop them from changing." A sad smile crossed my face. "How'd that work out?" To my surprise, he laughed. A genuine laugh. The first we'd shared in a very long time. "Not great, no." We sat quietly. Then he looked at me. "I'm sorry." Simple words. No excuses. No conditions. No qualifications. Just an apology. It didn't erase everything. Some wounds take time. Trust takes time. Relationships take time. But it mattered. It mattered a lot. Over the following months, things improved slowly. Phone calls became more frequent. Conversations became easier. Not perfect. Just better. Then one Sunday afternoon, I finally brought Benjamin to visit him. Dad sat in his recliner waiting, trying unsuccessfully to hide how nervous he was. I carried Benjamin into the living room. Dad looked at him for several seconds, without speaking. Then I placed the baby gently into his arms. The room became completely silent. My father stared down at his grandson. Benjamin grabbed one of his fingers immediately, as babies tend to do. Dad's eyes filled with tears, real tears. Not dramatic, not forced, just honest emotion. He swallowed hard, then whispered something I'll never forget. "He's the best thing that's happened to this family." A year earlier, he had looked at my pregnancy and seen shame. Now he looked at the same child and saw blessing. Life has a strange way of teaching lessons. Sometimes gently, sometimes not. Looking back, people occasionally ask whether I got revenge. I suppose that's one way to describe it. But honestly, it doesn't feel like revenge anymore. The real victory wasn't humiliating my father. It wasn't exposing him publicly. It wasn't watching his reputation suffer. The real victory was refusing to accept a lie about who I was. It was protecting my family, my marriage, my child, my dignity, and giving the truth enough room to stand on its own. In the end, that turned out to be more powerful than revenge ever could have been. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself, you're not alone. Sometimes the hardest thing we can do is tell the truth calmly and let it speak for itself. If this story meant something to you, thank you for spending this time with me, and I'd love for you to join me again for another story.